Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating text from 1821. It's from a book called Cottage Economy by a writer named William Cobbett. And what he gives us is, well, it's part recipe for homebrewed beer and part fiery manifesto for economic rebellion.
Okay, so let's just jump right in with this quote because it sets the whole thing up perfectly. Cobbett is telling us about a farmer he talked to who said that, in a single lifetime, an entire tradition just vanished. A whole class of people went from brewing their own beer to not brewing at all. So the big question is, what on earth happened?
Now for Cobbett, this wasn't just about losing some quaint little hobby. He believed that homebrewing was an absolute cornerstone of a healthy, independent life for the English working class, and he argues it was systematically taken away from them. He's about to show us exactly how and why.
He basically points to this perfect storm of economic problems. First, wages were falling, so people just had less money. Second, you get these huge new taxes slapped on the essential ingredients for beer, malt, and hops. And third, all of this opened the door for massive commercial brewers to create a total monopoly, buying up pubs and controlling everything.
So, with homebrewed beer suddenly out of reach for most families, what took its place? Well, this is where Cobbett identifies a pretty surprising villain in his story. He saw it as a social and economic plague on the working class, and that villain was tea.
Yeah, he absolutely hated it. To him, tea had zero nutritional value. It didn't give you strength for a hard day's work. In fact, he thought it did the opposite, that it weakened your nerves and made people feeble and lazy. He saw it as a total destroyer of health and productivity.
And this is where his argument gets really interesting. He doesn't just add up the cost of the tea and sugar. He includes everything. The tea tackle, the cups and spoons, the extra fuel needed for all those fires to boil the water, but most importantly, he calculates the cost of lost time. He figures the whole ritual wasted an hour a day, which adds up to 30 full work days a year for a woman, time she could have been doing something productive for the household.
So what's the grand total? Over 11 pounds a year. Now, to put that in perspective, that was about a third of a skilled laborer's entire yearly income. All of it, in Cobbett's eyes, just thrown away on this miserable, strength-sapping habit.
So if tea was the enemy inside the home, Cobbett had another one outside of it, the big commercial brewers. You might think, okay, if a laborer can't brew at home, why not just go down to the pub for a beer?
Well, Cobbett had a very blunt answer for that. He argued that the stuff they were selling, it wasn't really beer at all. He called it poisonous stuff.
He actually cites a recipe for the popular commercial beer porter that he found. It used a tiny bit of actual malt, and then this shocking list of additives. You've got treacle for sweetness, licorice for color, and even capsicum, that's hot pepper, to give it a kick that would mimic the warmth of alcohol. He warns about so-called beer doctors who are using these chemicals and even illegal drugs to hook their customers.
And this just shows you the economics of the whole racket. It cost the brewers less than 5 pence to produce a gallon of this stuff, but they were turning around and selling it to working people for 20 pence. That's a massive profit margin, and it was all built on selling a drugged, unhealthy knockoff product.
Okay, so after laying out all the problems, the tea, the poison from the pubs, Cobbett finally presents his solution, a clear, simple guide to empower every single family in England to start brewing their own wholesome beer again. And he breaks down the actual costs. For about £7, he shows how a family could brew 274 gallons of good, strong, nutritious beer. That's enough for a couple of quarts a day through the winter and even more during the hot harvest months in the summer.
And here's the kicker, the annual savings, over £4 a year. Now that's a serious amount of money. In the first year, those savings would more than pay for all the brewing equipment. And every year after that, as Cobbett points out, that's money for better clothes for the children, instead of being wasted on tea or pub poison.
And he makes the whole process sound so straightforward. He's like, look, don't be intimidated by this. Brewing isn't some complex science. It's a basic household skill, just like baking bread. He breaks it down into 5 simple steps, and he insists that the work isn't too heavy for a woman to manage, making it a true part of the cottage economy.
But of course, it's not that simple. Just when you think you've found the answer, Cobbett pulls back the curtain on one final, infuriating twist. It turns out the system was set up to protect the big brewers' monopoly and the government's tax money, and it had legal traps waiting for anyone who tried to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, bringing back this tradition wasn't just about relearning a skill. It meant going head-to-head with laws that were specifically designed to keep you dependent on the system.
Get this. There was an old law on the books
that made it illegal to lend or rent your brewing equipment to a neighbor if you lived in a town that had a public brew house. This was a direct attack on poor families, who might try to pool their resources and share tools.
And the penalty for breaking this law was £50. I mean, that's an absolutely astronomical sum that no laborer could ever dream of paying. It was a law designed to completely crush community cooperation.
And the final roadblock was maybe the most fundamental of all. It was illegal for a family to make their own malts from the barley they grew in their own garden. This simple process was forbidden, forcing them to buy the heavily taxed commercial malt and feed the very system Cobbett wanted them to escape.
And all of this brings us right to the heart of his argument. Cobbett's passionate, detailed guide to brewing, well, it was never really just about beer.
What he was really arguing for was a way to reclaim economic independence. It was about family health, swapping out drugs and tea for something wholesome. It was about social well-being, strengthening the family home. And maybe most of all, it was a practical guide for a quiet, personal rebellion against what he saw as unjust taxes and corporate control.
And reading Cobbett today really forces us to ask a question that feels just as relevant now as it did 200 years ago. In a world that is all about convenience, what do we lose when we forget how to provide for ourselves?